The success of Singapore as a pluralist society is probably unique in modern history. I cannot think of another which does it the way it is.
As a Singaporean, if you see influx of foreigners coming in or newcomers coming in, the concern is that, will they adopt our norms? Will they adopt our practices? Will they adopt our values, right?
Welcome to Singapore Unpacked, a podcast by the Institute of Policy Studies, Singapore. I'm your host, Liang Kaixin, Associate Director and also a former journalist. This is our SG60 year, and today we are diving into a question that is both ancient and very modern. How have great civilizations, Indic, Sinic, and Islamic shaped Singapore's identity today? So we are honored to have with us Professor Wang Gungwu, one of the world's most eminent historians of China and Southeast Asia, and also our 12th SR Nathan Fellow. And we are also joined by Dr. Melvin Tay, Research Fellow from IPS Social Lab. Melvin is part of the team behind the IPS CNA National Identity Study and IPS Working Paper 65 on Identity, Race, Religion and Study. So he brings the empirical data on how Singaporeans today think about identity, belonging and heritage. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So first thing first, Prof. Wang, we are very honored to have you here. We have often spoken about how Southeast Asia sits at a crossroads of great civilizations. So could you help us understand better what that means for Singapore's national identity?
We have very few records of what it was like before, but as a region, it's a very new region, and we've only been identified in this last 100 years or so. And before that, it was really a kind of waterway between oceans in which all we know about is that there was trade, there was exchange, and cultural influences had been occurring for a long, long time. And from what we know from the archaeology, the anthropology, linguistics, and other studies, we know that all that time, the openness of the ocean, of the waters, was what brought civilization from elsewhere to this part of the world. And the civilization that had already been in existence for 3,000 or 4,000 years, to our knowledge, would be those in India, those of the Indian Ocean world to the east, linking up with the Mediterranean world, which produced a civilization of its own, which very hard to find a name for it. I call it a Mediterranean civilization. And then to the north, there was Chinese civilization. These three were the ones that are well established. These were the three main ones. And there were other attempts to have civilizations, but they either failed, faltered, or just disappeared and no longer influenced other people. And the main importance about the idea of civilization is that it has no borders. It is represented by brilliant ideas about life on Earth, what is the meaning of life, we as human beings, what do we know about ourselves, how do we see our future, how do we see our past, how we link up with gods, devils, spiritual, whatever it is. So anybody who found them appealing could take and make it their own if they like. So with that background, our part of the world was part of that open ocean when people traded. And the Indian Ocean was probably the most active at that time. There was the Mediterranean, there was the Indian Ocean. The South China Sea was already on the edge of that ocean, but these are the central part of that growth of civilizations were Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean.
So where the trading boats were moving?
The trade was the main thing. And so when we first noticed that there was something like civilization passing on from one place to another, it was Indic civilization, because we have clear records from archaeology and so on to know that those ideas were brought by traders, and maybe accompanying those traders there would be priests and literate people had come from India to this part of the world. We know the layers of this through inscriptions and surviving texts here and there, which we recognize to be coming from India. And that was probably going on for about 1,000 or more years, all that time before anybody else came along. So there was a layer of this, what we later on identify as Hindu-Buddhist, because they had, in India itself, they had developed something which we now call Hinduism. They didn't have a name, but that is what we call it now. And Buddhism also came out of that same network. So they had passed it on already, a layer of that. So the next thing we know was that this trade went on, and during that time, the Chinese were coming south from the north. Their civilization was a continental civilization up in the Yellow River area. But they had come south and reached the coast, and they started to be trading, joining the trading people. But those trading people were already people influenced from India and other people coming from the Middle East. We don't know exactly who they were, but presumably they were the ancestors of the Arabs and the Persians and maybe some other people who we might call Indo-Europeans. So they were coming along, including the Dravidians of South India. They were joining in. So they were trading along, as far as we know, peacefully. Nobody had a navy, nobody fought it. We have no records of any wars or anything like that. And the trade was probably very specific goods which are in demand, which somebody produced, somebody wanted, and so on. That was on.
Around what period in history?
I would say about 3rd century, 1,000 years before Christ, at least the earliest. It could be earlier, but at least from what we can guess from the materials available, about 1,000 years before Christ, something was going on already. And in the meantime, cultural exchanges took place. So mysteriously, people began to select what they want. I mean, for example, we know that the people in the Malay archipelago picked on Hindu and Buddhist ideas, which became part and parcel of everything that came afterwards. And that goes back a long, long time. And so that it didn't surprise us that when other ideas came later on, they would also pick and choose, select the bits that attracted them and incorporate them into whatever they were developing for themselves. So gradually, they developed local cultures. Their own culture consisting of bits and pieces of the civilizations that they came in contact with from India, from the Middle East, so-called, from the Mediterranean world, and from China. Goods they produced, natural products they had, spices or whatever it is. They already had that. But no clear records of how it was done. We have Arabic records in the Arabic language, some records in Indian languages, but very few. And most of the language materials that we have today were in Chinese for the first 1,000 years of the Christian era. And so from that, we reconstruct an area. It looked as if, from the record, you look as if the Chinese dominated, but actually the records show very clearly the Chinese were only part of that trade. But they happened to keep the records. The other people didn't bother. It wasn't important enough. The trade was going smoothly.
But in Singapore, we know that there's a 700 years of history. Is that correct?
You see, by the time Temasek appears on the record for the first time at the end of the 14th century, by that time, there was a so-called Srivijaya set of little port cities in the Straits of Malacca and down to Realinga archipelago. And there were also the Javanese states we know from whole of Java and reaching a climax with the Majapahit Empire. And up the peninsula, we know that there had been a Khmer Empire. And before that, names which we are not clear about, Funan and Champa and all that, these are all already a kingdom. But by the time we have them on the records that the Chinese preserved, they were already Hindus. The Cham kingdoms on the border of Vietnam were already highly Hinduized.
It's like what we see in Angkor Wat in Cambodia, is it?
Even before the Khmers, the Chams are already Hinduized, but the Khmers came after the so-called the Chunla, and so they were already Hindu-Buddhist. They were not separable in those days. And on the other side, the Chinese had reached Vietnam. So a Chinese kind of civilizational values had reached the northeastern corner of what we call Southeast Asia today. But next to them was a Hinduized set of people called the Chams. And we call it Champa, but actually they're different little states. They are people who are very closely related to the Malays, who are part of what are called the Austronesian language speakers. So already there was this mixture when the records first appeared. But it was very clear that Chinese made no secret of it. These were people already civilized.
Okay.
But their civilization was not the same as Chinese. I mean, Srivijaya was probably leaning towards Buddhism by the time it appears in history. And that by that time Java was probably more Hindu. But then you find a beautiful site like Borobudur, which is Buddhist, in the middle of all that. So we don't distinguish between the Hindus and the Buddhists at that time. They were more or less one part of one civilizational complex. So in that context, it was multi-civilizational already, but each local culture selected bits. And this is what's so fascinating to me, the openness of it all. They were not saying, this is mine, that is yours, you cannot have this, and nobody interfered. I like what you have to offer, and it appeals to me, I take it. And I take it, what I like. If I don't like it, I dispose of it. For example, there are no problems with the classical texts from the Hindus. I mean, the Ramayana, Mahabharata, they took it beautifully. They liked all the stories. They made it part of their own heritage. All the things that Indian dance, Indian music, Indian art, and so on. They took that, all their constructions, architecture, entirely of Indian origin, with some local genius in the middle of it as they modified it for their own interest. So no problem at all. And they took the language. I mean, we have Malay language inscriptions written in the Sanskrit script, for example, found at the time. So in that context, that openness, that was what fascinated me was it continued like that. That was part of their heritage, to be open to new ideas which they want. A good example, for example, they took so much from Hinduism that I mentioned earlier on, but they did not take the caste system.
Oh, they didn't?
They didn't. They didn't like that. Somehow their sense of relationships between
more
humans
egalitarian.
was not so hierarchical. And there was a bit of it, but it soon disappeared. They never really took the caste system, even though they were Hinduized and Buddha in many ways. But of course, Buddhism, one of the appeals of Buddhism, Buddhism did not take the caste system either. So that's another element to it. So Hinduism and Buddhism began to separate. One of the differences was because they did not accept the caste system. That's one example. Whereas other things, no problem. And that is the background. And all that was true until about 1500. Because up to that point, the Mediterranean was represented basically by Islamic travelers, the Arab, Persian people who came, and many were Indians. They become Indian Muslims. And those who arrived in China became Chinese Muslims. I mean, the Muslims were trading in Guangzhou from the 7th century onwards, and they were trading in Fujian by the 10th or 11th century, large numbers of them. And there were lots of Muslim traders all the way, So nobody bothered about what your religion was or where the borders were. And the trade was extremely profitable.
And in 1500s, that's when the Portuguese started traveling, right?
That's a change. The change was this. When the Portuguese arrived from the Indian Ocean and the Spanish arrived from the Pacific across from Latin America to the Philippines, what they brought to this part of the world was the wars of the Mediterranean, the wars between the Christians and the Muslims. This had not
the Crusades, right?
Nobody fought like that, as far as we know, before that. But when the Christians arrived, and because they wanted to trade with China and India, and they had been blocked by the Islamic forces in the Middle East, they couldn't get across. And you remember how Marco Polo could only go to China because the Mongols took over, and the Mongols were not Muslims, and they could go. But as long as the Muslims controlled the trade, the Christians, the Venetians and the Genoans, they couldn't get to the trade of India and China. They had to go through the Muslims. So they were very frustrated. They always had to depend on Muslim traders and goodwill of the Muslims to trade with India and China. And they knew India and China were the richest countries in the world at the time. So when they found their way to India, according to the Spanish, they thought that the whole of Americas were India. As to this day, they're called Red Indians.
Yeah.
They thought it was India. Whereas the Portuguese coming down the other side, they really got to India. And they got to
They
India.
made it.
Yeah, they really got to India around the Cape. And when they arrived there, they knew that they were up against the Muslims.
Okay.
And that they were enemies, old enemies from
They were fighting in Europe anyway,
from
right?
the Mediterranean. They'd be fighting
Yeah.
for the Crusades for nearly 1,000 years before that. About 800 or 900 years, they've been fighting each other. So for the first time, that sense of rivalry, competition, and actual enemies, although we are trading, we are just not going to cooperate. We want to monopolize the trade against you because the Christians and Muslims were used to fighting each other and never cooperated.
So they brought their fights to Southeast
Asia.
Asia.
So they brought the Mediterranean wars into Asia. And then you have a different Asia.
Okay.
And then we're now talking about a new kind of Asia in which a civilization, in this case, two parts of a Mediterranean civilization were fighting in the Indian Ocean and reaching Southeast Asia when Malacca was taken. So when the Portuguese took Malacca, that was the beginning of a new story. And that is where the civilization began the fight. And they were, and to my mind anyway, not everybody agrees with me on this, to my mind, they're part of one civilization. They're all one God, same book, same, Judeo-Christian Islam is really one God. But the only difference was the Greco-Roman part was left a little bit out. But this part, the Judeo-Christian Islam part, was that part of the Mediterranean that brought the fighting into the Indian Ocean. And then that fighting never stopped. Because the Portuguese, after Malacca, the Malay peoples moved down, and this is where Singapore got involved. And that was when, the point is that Singapore had a part to play in the creation of Malacca in the first place. So they were involved, and all the Malacca rulers and the soldiers, when they were defeated, the Portuguese moved south to Johor, the Johor River, to the Realenga, Bintang and Batam and all this area, and they controlled this part. In defense, and they tried to get back to Malacca, but they never succeeded. For the very simple reason,
Why?
the Portuguese had better ships and could fire cannons from their ships, in which nobody else could.
At that time.
And they had developed that in Europe. And the Muslim navies that all along the coast of Persian Gulf, right down to Bay of Bengal, and so couldn't cope
fight against
with
them,
the Portuguese navy.
Yeah.
And after they took Malacca, they went to China, took Macau, and then they went to the Spice Islands, way back, all the way. All that was completely dominated by that. So the story changed. So now we talk about civilization now in which they actually were in conflict. And as I say, it was a conflict within one, we might say, complex civilization that brought all this fighting to this part of the world and changed the nature of the relationships in the world. And then, but all that time, the Chinese were not involved. Because the Chinese had, when Zheng He had his voyages 100 years earlier, had sailed through all that. As far as we know, there were no naval battles between the Muslims and the Chinese. They were trading. And at the end of it all, Zheng He came back after 7 voyages. They said, there are no enemies out there. And so they destroyed their navy, burned all the ships, and forgot about it all. Nothing to worry about. So all that kind of peaceful relationship, relatively peaceful relationship, was completely overturned by this fighting.
Okay.
And we haven't actually stopped ever since. You might say that.
Okay.
By the time Singapore became significant, when the British chose it in the middle of while they're looking for something.
In 1890,
after they had defeated the Napoleonic Wars and got been in Java and so on, they were looking for a place to trade with China, because in the past they never needed it. They would trade it with India. But once they wanted to trade with China, then Singapore became more important than Penang. At the southern end of the Straits of Malacca was better than the northern end, so they chose Singapore, as we know the stories. I need hardly tell you. But that meant that when Singapore really came into history as an important port, it was a part of a British empire, which was already probably the most developed, modern, secular, post-Enlightenment civilization in the world at the time. So I mean,
the
this
British
is
Empire.
the background to the story, as far as I can see.
Yeah. So if we start from 1819, or maybe we even push it further down to 1965 when Singapore became independent, is it too young to have its own national identity?
Well, you see, during all that time, there was never any thought of Singapore becoming a nation. We all know that. And most of all, we are very much reminded of it in our 60th anniversary. All this talk about how Singapore became independent. And nobody really expected it. And when it came about, it was a shock to all those who had expected Singapore to be part of that whole British territory, British area colony and protected Malay states, to become one country called Malaya, or later on called Malaysia. That was not at all surprising. We all expected that. But when it was not a member of that part and become an independent country, nobody expected it. So to talk about Singapore as any kind of culture in the midst of all that, identifiable as Singaporean, I think we can't really talk about, except to say that it was already mainly a modern, secular, Western civilization with the Enlightenment background,
from the British Empire,
with a Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman history at the back, further back in its history. That was the roots of that civilization. But by the time it becomes secular, it becomes the basis of a national nation state, and then a national empire, which was global in its extent, the largest empire at that time ever, in fact, in history. But then Singapore was already part of it. All through Singapore's history, from 1819 to 1965, was part and parcel of an imperial network of port cities in which Singapore was a key element. And everything about Singapore was exactly the same as wherever British officials ran every port city in the empire.
Okay.
So Singapore had a distinctive, you might say, British imperial culture. Modern, secular, progressive in the way it was, you might say, capitalist, industrial revolution product, and actually I would say already a fully capitalist economy. Linked up with the capitalist system of Western Europe. Fully fledged, just born like that. From the day it was born.
It was made for trading,
It
right?
was a modern civilization. So Singapore is an exceptional case in the region. It could have happened in Hong Kong or Macau, but it didn't happen in Macau because the Portuguese wasn't that powerful. And Hong Kong was just a place where the British were really using it to get into China and got very much caught up with a very specific set of problems. But Singapore was different because it was open to in every direction.
Okay. It's
It
not
was-
so near China, right?
And you know, China, it was near the whole of the Malay archipelago, the whole of even Indochina. Of course, India, they could reach it from India, but now they can reach the other side, but they weren't interested. You find that, for example, the British weren't interested at all in Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and China. They just went straight to Canton and to Macau side and wanted to trade with China because they'd been trading with China for the tea and then later on the opium for almost 250 years before that. So Singapore was already part of a big system, ready-made, with a civilization more or less defined exactly as the British wanted it to be. A place where all the traders can get together, no matter where they came from, whatever civilization they represented, they could come here and do whatever they like, as long as they obeyed British laws and allowed the British to run everything. And they invited them to come. They were free. It was a free port. That was a revolutionary idea at the time. A free port, no taxes, and they welcomed people to take over the land, open up the island, and offered you land to settle. Here the Chinese, there the Indian, there the Malays, and so on. All that was done administratively as part and parcel of a British imperial system, which was modern, imperialist, capitalist, as modern as you can get in the 19th century. And this continued. And even as Europe developed, Singapore was part and parcel of that, always following what the British Empire was doing. So I think that's the beginning of Singapore's story. So there was no question of a Singapore culture or civilization at 1965.
Okay, then maybe I'll just move a little bit to Melvin and maybe fast forward a little bit more to 2025. Because Melvin, you are doing a lot of research in IPS Social Lab, right? Doing a lot of surveys on Singaporeans, how they think about national identity also, right? So do you think Singaporeans still feel these like historical legacies of all these ancient civilizations in their daily lives?
So I think Prof. Wang has, provided us with a very strong scaffold, right, of, what happened before 1965. And I think for most Singaporeans, the idea of Singapore, what comprises the Singapore identity, who we are, a lot of it is effectively a manicured narrative, right? You would have read it in your social studies textbooks. You would have read it, in the papers and all. And it is, a narrative that we typically don't challenge. We typically, look at it as well. That's the one narrative that we do. I think I've heard a lot from Prof. Wang in terms of, different cultures, peoples picking what they choose, and, if it works for them, it works. And, if it doesn't, then, okay, let's trash it, and, let's take what works for us. And we do see that in manifesting in, some of the responses that our respondents, in relations to our questions on national identity, right, have shared with us. I think Prof. Wang mentioned like how, certain tenets of Hinduism, you might import, certain practices, but not others. Perhaps, the caste, system, you don't see it manifested as much in other places. And you do see that even now today, you see some of those semblances of, different pieces, parts and parcels of these civilizations, as they are shared. Perhaps not so much so through, like trade routes or ocean channels. One parallel now that we can draw is, through, online material, content, what you watch on Netflix and all. Well, perhaps that's the new, sea or ocean that, we are exposed to at this point in time. And perhaps we are at a state or cast where we have to think, like, what works for us, right? And that's where when we look at the survey data, when, we ask respondents, okay, do we have a Singapore identity? I think that answered that question is actually rendered moot because instead our respondents, I think over 95%, say that yes, we have an identity. So I guess that's a quick win, right? Since 1965, 60 years old, we have some semblance of an identity. Whether we can agree on what constitutes or comprises the identity, then of course, as we drill down what comprises the Singapore identity, I think there are many different answers that we find here. And many of those hark back to what, Prof. Wang mentioned through civilizations, the use of languages, even through some of, the very well-established principles of Singapore identity, multiracial, multi-religious, that melting pot of cultures. If you walk down certain areas in Singapore, you would hit a mosque, you would hit a temple, and then, you will pass, a church. And that kind of is, some or just one of many facets of, Singapore identity that we see today. And beyond, the language, beyond, learning to live in harmony, regardless of the different religions that you might practice, or, the different races that, the citizens might come from, at the very, crux of it, how does that civilization translate in practice? If you were to ask, the median Singaporean, walking down the street, do you think, that history or civilization is still manifested in our identity? It is indirect at best, but you can certainly see the impact that it has given to your, daily Singaporeans through the food that we eat. Food was one thing that came out in, some of our open-ended responses, and also in terms of your, the way that we live, certain practices and norms also.
But also from your survey, I realized that the embrace of multiculturalism is also very high up in your survey also, right?
So I think at the very, we did ask respondents, to effectively tell us in an open-ended fashion, what comprises the Singapore identity. And then we also took a look at, to what extent do they feel that, some of these aspects are more important than others. It is true that, tenets such as good food, speaking Singlish, for instance, all these do come up at the top of that list, i.e. It was cited the most, right? Many respondents would have at least cited some version of language, some version of food, some practices and all. But at the end of the day, when asked, what is the most important part of identity, a lot of it then goes down to, some of these practices, multiculturalism, multi-racial, multi-religious, that want to stay and perhaps, work out potential differences, potential, areas where, one might not agree with the other, but, how do you then go about navigating some of these differences? And I think that's where you see respondents actually landing on some of these aspects of behavior, be it, something that they feel was appropriate, not appropriate, etc. And we further did, kind of like analysis on, different buckets of identity. And of course, at the very top, as mentioned, you have your food, you have your, language and all, and these are perhaps more the daily lived experiences, the part of that, in the middle.
The more tangible parts, is it?
The more tangible parts, right?
Okay.
You even have respondents, kind of throwing, okay, what does the Singapore identity mean to you? You see a Merlion, right? Or the Singapore passport, it's strongest in the world, and, and these are very tangible aspects. It's a thing that you can touch, you can feel, and you can, kind of experience, what it brings to you. But the second layer pertains to, practices beyond multiculturalism. There's also meritocracy, or at least, the idea, that, certain practices, be it in commerce, be it in governance, how should we go about doing things? And that part is always seen as more important. In fact, when we ask respondents, okay, you have all these different areas of identity that you have, you have kind of identified, right? To what extent do these correlate, with your sense of pride, with your sense of belonging to the nation and all? At the end of the day, it's not about the food you eat, or whether you speak Singlish or not, or whether you have a passport, that's red, that enables you visa-free access, right? It's more about your practices. It's more about whether you buy into, doing things a certain way in Singapore. And of course, at the very crux of it, whether you are engaged as a Singaporean, that final layer about whether, well, you might not live in Singapore, but do you feel that you belong to Singapore, or do you feel pride as a Singaporean? Now, we have a lot of other, different questions that state, ask them, okay, to what extent do you feel that there are conflicts, right, with the Singapore identity? And of course, usual suspects, if you were not born here, then
maybe you're not so Singaporean.
Yeah, not so Singaporean, right?
Okay.
Local born, foreign born. We do have things like, okay, whether you have served NS or not, does that make you Singaporean or less, And some of these other things do come up, even things like, being woke, right? If you are woke, are you any less Singaporean than others? But the fact of the matter is that, yes, we do see that, a proportion of respondents indicate that, yes, it does come into conflict with identity, but from perhaps a research point of view, it could potentially be about, figuring out where the boundaries of identity, stop, and, perhaps this is our way of navigating those boundaries. What is considered in and what is considered out. But I guess nonetheless, the idea of identity, it's not something that you can, check off a list of things. Okay, if you're self-NS, if you, were born here, if you have done this, done that, that makes you Singaporean, and if you are above 50 points out of 100, you pass it. It's not that kind of thing, right? It's a lot more subjective, and a lot of it pertains to the lived experience of the individual. And you, for every Singaporean that you ask, whether this person, is, more Singaporean than the others, you probably get a different response.
Yeah. So Melvin, I think you are talking about a bit of tension over there, right? So on one hand, there's this pragmatic, forward-looking, almost secular identity. Then on the other hand, as what Prof. Wang, you pointed out, there's this deep cultural and religious instincts also, right? So Prof. Wang, do you see if there's a clash here in terms of identity, in terms of like the modern Singapore and the history and culture that's influencing it?
I can't help going back to political structure, administrative structure, legal structure, and so on, because when Singapore became independent, it straight away announced that it was to be a nation, a member of the United Nations, as one of the 100 and whatever it is at that time, number of nations in the world. And there was a model for what is a nation state. It was not clearly defined. There were many varieties, but it was an idea in the end that every state with borders would become a nation. And some in the European model, where it started, nation state was invented in 18th century Europe and only developed in the 19th and 20th. It's still developing in Europe. There are still nation states being created in Europe even today. So this is not a simple model which we can just copy.
It's still evolving, right? Yeah.
We have to actually take the model and say, where does it fit in? Where do we fit in? How do we use this model to develop something that be viable, successful, and ultimately unite everybody together? So to that extent, whoever provided the leadership for that period when Singapore separated did have to make major decisions. And one of the major decisions was that it should be a plural society. A state based on not many states agreed to that. Most nation states that use the European model use the example of one language, one religion, one shared history. And for slightest differences, you create countries like Netherlands and Belgium, Denmark and Norway, Czechoslovakia, Czech and Slovakia, and later on Yugoslavia, between the Serbia and Croatia. I mean, how different were they? I mean, they actually come from the same, as far as I can tell, same civilizational roots. They shared almost everything. They shared the values and so on, very similar. But they have used certain identity markers to draw a border between us and them. And then they say, this history of this part within those borders have thousands of years of history, which in my mind doesn't make any sense at all. We're different because we've decided we shall be a plural society. We don't expect any one culture to dominate or any culture derived from any one single civilization. Whatever each culture represented by each group of people who reside in this plural society, because it's a plural and there are many groups, we will respect each of them. And they're all equal in the eyes of the state, in the eyes of the law. And this, of course, brings me back to probably the most important single thing they took from the British system that created Singapore in the first place, and that is they took the law. The legal system was peculiar to Britain. No other place in Southeast Asia had that system of law except Malaysia, but Malaysia had already modified it in other ways, and Singapore decided to be pluralist and using the law to defend that plural nature of the society, to make sure that all these ideas about equality of the peoples, equality of the different cultural and civilizational values that have been brought in by different peoples are equal before the law, and the law protects them and And the government makes sure that this system of law is fair and just to everybody. Now that was a definite inheritance from the British Empire, the one that, as I said, from the beginning was established. Retaining that, then allowing freedom for other people to draw upon civilizations, cultures elsewhere, whatever you like that you need for, that would be good for Singapore, that'd be good. For example, they took a major decision. It must be an industrial policy. It must be a manufacturing country. It can't just depend on trade. No, that's a major division.
That's
decision.
very different from Hong Kong, right?
Because before that, Singapore was primarily just a trading place. Singapore didn't make much. People just people in and out. You buy and sell and you do very well. But now they say you cannot survive on that alone. You must have your own manufacturing base. So that was a major decision. It meant a tremendous amount of work went into that. And of course, you have to have your own armed forces to defend yourself.
Yes.
You have to do all that. Then you have to decide what language to use. And so the decision that every language was equal, but English was the official language because we don't use the language of any one group. We use a language which belongs to none of us.
Okay.
But then everybody feels it's fairer. We all have an equal position and so on. So somehow it was accepted. Now these are political decisions.
Yeah, by
And
the
so
People's Action
by a
Party.
group of people who thought the only way Singapore can survive and ultimately thrive and develop into something significant is to make a certain set of decisions which will make a difference, which would provide a framework in which ultimately a Singapore national culture or an identity could evolve. But it is still work in progress. I mean, I would have to say it's still work in progress, and there's still plenty yet to be done, and there's still plenty of uncertainties here and there which could make the situation more difficult or easier. It depends on who makes the decision and how policies are adjusted to respond to different changes in the neighborhood or in the world, in world affairs. So a small country has to respond to whatever else is happening elsewhere, which affects Singapore. And Singapore, in a way it has developed, had decided to become open to not just to the region, but to the world, to look upon the world as possibilities. You don't simply look upon your neighborhood. You realize that just looking at the neighborhood is not safe enough for you. You need to look beyond that.
As a global
that is
city,
a major
right?
decision to say that we're not just going to be a nation state and just of Singapore. That nation state can survive best if it was operated in a global environment. So the idea of a global city was crucial to there's the idea that you can marry a nation state with a global city to become something unique was a very imaginative leap, as it were, into the future, to imagine a future like that. And I'm not sure that anybody had a clear idea in the 1960s and 70s, but the general idea was that you cannot survive if you simply look narrowly at just the neighborhood or look at how you have always done things. You have to do new things. And I think the decision about retaining the law and making that absolutely the basis on which things are done, and everybody respects it, and you make the law, at least to the majority of people, fair and just, then you have a better chance. And that will protect the plural society. The plural society doesn't exist on its own. It has to be defended and corral into a way of thinking which makes the relationship between each of these pluralist groups are all based on what the law allows. And so that is I would say, a platform on which a nation could be built. It still hasn't completed, it's not complete, but it is moving in that direction. But the extraordinary thing about it and the uniqueness of it all is that this idea of a plural society, people have talked about it elsewhere, but as far as I know, nobody has succeeded as well as Singapore. The success of Singapore as a pluralist society is probably unique in modern history. I cannot think of another which does it the way it is. But It is so because it's still open. This is one of the, again, I come back to the word, because it still treats other ideas elsewhere and so on as something that we can make use of to strengthen ourselves and make ourselves stronger, more prosperous, and safer and more secure. And that we're ready to be open to all new ideas. Every new idea that we believe would help Singapore, we will take. This is the kind of approach which I think is extraordinary.
So, Prof. and Melvin, I think when you mentioned about plural society, right? I mean, it alludes to the CMIO model, right, that Singapore is using. And of course, a lot of people, they might think of their race and religion as their very strong identity marker, right? So I think, Melvin, you did a survey on this also. Can you tell us more about how their religion and race define themselves, and how does this like compete with the national identity?
Right. So I guess in Singapore, race and religion is highly conflated, and it's best to talk about both of them in tandem with each other. We do realize that when we asked respondents, Singapore residents, right, to what extent these tenets of identity, which is most important to you. Right. You do, of course, have a sizable majority indicating, okay, well, the Singapore aspect of my identity is, the most important. But what we also noted was, sizable other proportions of respondents indicating that it was race, it was religion. In fact, and you do see an uptick of those, proportions indicating that it was actually religion that kind of gives them meaning as to who they are. Now, this in itself, I think the finding itself, it's not eyebrow raising kind of finding. At the end of the day, people gravitate towards whatever gives them meaning, whatever kind of gives them that certainty, perhaps, that well, they are who they are, and there are certain set of values, principles that guide their actions, etc. But I guess that itself, it's always seen in terms of, okay, how does this then conflict with the Singapore identity? And that's a very interesting take, simply because the idea of a Singapore identity, like this whole idea of embracing pluralism in the first place, if you embrace the idea of pluralism, well, that also means that open-mindedness, right, to accept that while we have that shared belonging to a piece of land that you call Singapore, but your practices, what you believe in, these might not necessarily be the same across Singaporeans. Of course, there is that glue right at the start, that perhaps that sense of belonging, that sense of pride, certain principles that kind of wash across majority of Singaporeans. But perhaps the one difference that that you see in this unique case, right, of Singapore, and how that pluralism in practice, how has that panned out, is that perhaps that glue, that those attributes that kind of form the social glue are particularly small. Right. But beyond that range of difference, right? Be it whether you were born here or you have migrated here, regardless of your religion, regardless of race, your class, some of sexuality, some of these other attributes, the room for difference is wide, it's huge. And I guess I do concur also that having a set of institutions, rules, laws to, well, all of you are different, but you play by a certain set of you everyone reads the same rule book, and everyone should more or less concur by the same rule book, right? You do see it also articulated in to some people would look at this state of affairs and say, well, this is social engineering, right? This is like kind of
but Singapore is actually very man-made, right?
It is a product of social engineering at the end of the day. But perhaps what cannot be understated is that, well, it is social engineering from 1965, but the facts are that the idea of success, the relative, the levels of conflict or lack thereof, plus the general social peace, social harmony, it's there, right? So
people agree to set aside differences also, right, or live with differences.
Yep, and that speaks to kind of like it's kind of like the social contract that you ink in part with the government, right? Like in exchange for, well, perhaps lesser freedom, right, in certain respects, but you do reap the benefits of, well, a more peaceful society. You know that you are living in harmony. You don't need to bother about certain aspects of but safety, security that would potentially afflict you without this system. So, well, at the end of the day, the idea is that if you're Singaporean, you're proud to be Singaporean. You might accept this as well. This is your this is something that we should aspire towards. And of course, you would have detractors that say, hey, should we think more, right, about, okay, is this the be all and all? Is that the end goal, or could it be that is there some room for deviation? Perhaps within this rule book, or this set of like institutions, practices, and all. Is it time perhaps to think about it, take a hard look on your 60th anniversary, and well, is it still working for us?
But Prof, because you were also saying that the way that Singapore succeeded was to be a global city and also to be open also, right? And I guess that can only succeed when we are open towards like immigration and people coming into Singapore. So from that aspect, like how would the different waves of immigration and also maybe the most recent one affect our identity?
Well, I think one of the things that always struck me was that those civilizations that had influenced the region before modern times, they are also modernizing. Each of those civilizations, whether they're Islamic or Christian or Indic or Sinic, they all are modernizing. They also have been adapting and picking and choosing from the Western Christian post-Enlightenment civilization that has dominated us for a couple of hundred years. They too have been adapting to it and picking and cherry picking, as it were, what they want. And they also have distinctively produced a modern civilization of their own. Each of them have become modernizing in its own way. So I'm pretty certain that individuals in Singapore are also noticing that. So even when they are conscious of their own culture and treated as equal in Singapore, they're also aware that their own ancestral culture has changed in somewhat elsewhere, and to what extent they respond to it, and to what extent they choose to do it the Singapore way, and to do it the way other Singaporeans will also do, and watch how other Singaporeans are responding to the modern civilizations of their ancestral homes. So that itself is so fascinating, because all these civilizations are changing. So what that tells us is that globalization is not a static thing. Globalization is dynamic, and it is a moving target, not only for you to pick and choose, but it itself has different emphases at different times. And you actually not only have to, can choose, sometimes you have to choose certain things because of the circumstances. And certain things you can pick and choose freely. And all that variety of things, I mean, for example, in science and technology, you don't have much choice. If the science and technology is advancing at a fantastic speed somewhere else, and you want to be part of that global change, you have to take all of it. You can't actually pick and choose. Some things you can't. The economic and financial systems and so on, whether in terms of exchange or currency or whatever it is, of budgeting and tariffs and taxes and all these things, you have to more or less accept that certain frameworks. You cannot just move away from it. You have to take some. But even then, you can probably still adjust it to suit your purposes best. And you can still have some negotiating room, as it were, with those you deal with. So all these are constantly challenging whoever provides the leadership and the people who elect the leaders in Singapore. How capable are they in responding to these uncertain changes that are happening as we see it today? So, in fact, the last 60 years, by any standards, are relatively peaceful years compared to the centuries before and compared to the uncertainties of the future. And I'm not talking about war. I'm talking about advances in technological, and other civilizational ideas changing in response to the technological changes. All these are going to happen. we know it's going to happen. But exactly how each of them develop, we're not certain. To what extent Singapore responds and capable to provide some distinctive contribution to that globalized civilization that is emerging, it's also something that Singaporeans should be involved in as a global city. So even as you think in terms of the security of a nation state, you have that need to survive as a global city. Make sure that your nation state never gets bogged down in some narrow-minded sense of your own identity and so narrowly defined, but constantly responding to all the possibilities, potentialities, and the challenges that are being offered almost every day. So this is a completely new set of circumstances. The leaders of 60 years ago didn't have to face such problems, and certainly not at the speed at which they are occurring. The new generation has to do that. Now, these are very challenging things. So the Singapore identity itself cannot be narrowed down to say it must be like this. The Singapore identity itself is constantly changing and adapting to these circumstances in a globalized world, as a global city. And your nation state, because the nature of this small nation state, it has to be a global city at the same time, forces it to be even more sensitive and more capable to respond to these changes.
So, Prof, I think you were also sort of alluding to the US versus China, the whole changing global order and how increasingly Singapore might be asked to choose sides even, right? And especially with, Singapore, we have like quite a lot of our population who are ethnically Chinese and maybe thinking about what it means when, the motherland, China, is becoming more and more powerful, right? So what does it mean to the people who are Chinese in Singapore?
What I find so interesting is that the way China and United States are developing is that they're becoming more and more like each other. Because when you actually look at what they're competing in the areas that both sides recognize as being vital to their future and their place in the world. And they're competing in the most essential parts of their competition are exactly in those areas where they expect to provide leadership in the world. And in terms of, whether in terms of science and technology or in terms of the economic systems and so on, and how you manage the economic challenges of the future in terms of markets, manufacturers, consumer demand, supply skid lines, and supply chains and so on. All these things are constantly being challenged and changing. Both sides are actually responding in different ways. And in extraordinary ways, I find that they're actually converging to some kind of common concern, which is actually global. They recognize that the whole world has to deal with some of these problems. And if they want to be number one or number two, and however they define it, they cannot ignore these things. They must be competing in those same areas. So what is left that they're really arguing about? What they're really arguing about is, how do we do it? Do we do it by free electoral liberal elections, or do we do it by managerial, Mandarin-like, harder-like administrative structures which are unitary and centered on a powerful state which is secure, safe, and happy, and so on. So they are ultimately now they're facing political changes. How to do it? Is this system better for managing these extraordinarily dangerous and uncertain changes that we're all facing today? Can we do it better by being more centralized and more organized and management focused with meritocratic systems, chosen carefully people who are proven capacities and so on, and the other way by popular elections and so on, and a lot of involvement of money, of capitalist money funding all kinds of political views, ranging a wide range of views, which are continually flourishing in their own way and causing tremendous discord and this turmoil in their society. One side decides that is not for us. The other side, that is says that is really going back to the past. That is regressive, to go back kind of authoritarian system. So they have different judgments made on that one. Those judgments are what we are facing about making a choice. The rest of it is not. I would say 90% of whatever is going on today, then we have no choice. We have to go along with all these, the most recent thing. Both of them are competing in that area.
Technology.
And whether we take something that we're learning from a Chinese scientist or an American one or a Chinese business manager or business system or American one, that is matter of national interest. Which one suits us better? But the major quarrel they have is a political one. And that one has got nothing to do with all this. That one is something, you might say, is how do you manage better? And it's not a closed issue. It is actually a genuine choice problem.
Okay.
Is one system better for getting things done effectively and so on and so forth? And the other side say, no, the best thing to do is to free, let everybody be creative, innovative, and so on, and then you'll get things done even better. But the Chinese are saying, yes, so far so good, but we can find that if we did that completely all the way, we will upset everything within our own system. We can't operate like that. We are, in our system, this is the way it works, and we know how to work it. And of course, in the eyes of many, they are succeeding extremely well in achieving what they are doing. But that may not
work for everyone.
Not for everyone. So you still have a choice. But the 90% that they're really competing in, I think we have no choice. We have to join in, take the best of what they offer, learn from each of them. That final choice is a different matter altogether. And we have to distinguish between what we don't have a choice, and I say 90%. And this applies to both the Chinese and the Americans. They are facing the same kind of competition. But that last 10% on which they fundamentally disagree, can you come to a compromise there and come to some balance in which it is a bit more free or is a bit less authoritarian, and then find something which actually works best for everybody? Nobody knows that can happen. I mean, there are people in China who like more freedom. There are people in America who like more authority, they're like a populist leader like the president of the United States, using his power, even abusing his power to get what he wants. And abusing his power in a way that I don't think the Secretary General of China would dare to do. He can't do in China. The President of the United States can do because he has certain powers constitutionally agreeable, which the Chinese don't have. So it's not as straightforward as it's not that straightforward. One is one extreme example. They're not like that. They're actually pretty close, sharing the same problem. How do we run the system that we are 90% competing in? How do we make our system more effective and more successful than yours? So that, I think, as a small state, global city, we look at them and say, what do we pick from each of them that will suit us? As long as we're allowed to choose, allowed to choose.
Okay, so I'll just bring it back to Melvin, right? Because we're talking about immigration, and I guess it's going to be quite thorny for our political leaders to manage. Then, in your survey, then, how do Singaporeans view immigrations, and does it enhance or detract from national identity?
I guess in terms of that, we noted that for Singaporeans, a lot of them cited inflows, right, of immigrants, regardless of whether they felt that identity has no change or gotten weaker, especially for these groups of Singaporeans. And of course, it is something of a moot point also. And perhaps the way forward, for political leaders and all, is how do they then navigate some of these conflicts with people already in Singapore, right? As a Singaporean, if you see influx of foreigners coming in or newcomers coming in, the concern is that will they adopt our norms, will they adopt our practices, will they adopt our values, right? And if you feel that okay, yes, perhaps your take on immigration will be a bit more benign as compared to someone who doesn't.
Okay. Okay, so with that, with so much conversation about the great civilizations and how Singapore is reacting to it and how does it affect our national identity, I think this is a ongoing conversation and we need another episode. So with that, thank you Prof. Wang and Melvin for joining us today for this episode of Singapore Unpacked. Thank you. So if you've enjoyed this episode, do follow or subscribe to the show, leave a rating or share with someone who cares about Singapore's future as much as you do. Thank you so much for listening in. See you on the next episode of Singapore Unpacked.